She stood outside the glass building for a moment longer than usual, her reflection barely visible in the mirror-like surface that loomed above. The lobby buzzed with movement. Heels on marble, clipped voices, the low hum of elevator doors opening and closing. She adjusted the strap of her modest black bag and walked in, eyes forward, shoulders straight. No one looked twice. No one paused to greet her. And that was the point. That was the game. They didn't see her because they never had. Inside, the office smelled of ambition. New leather, fresh ink, overbrewed coffee. The floors above held all the power, but down here, in the rows of cubicles and shared spaces, women like her existed in the margins. Filing documents, booking meetings, managing calendars they would never be invited to. She was efficient. She was polite. She did not overstep. Not visibly, anyway. But while others whispered gossip near the water cooler or scrolled idly through their phones, she read investor briefings, dissected earnings calls, memorized every line of the company's internal structure. She took notes in her head, not just of numbers but of patterns, who got promoted, who didn't, who made decisions, and who got the credit. They treated her like background noise. She was asked to pour coffee for clients she herself had researched. She was handed trash by men who assumed she was there to collect it. She heard laughter echo from behind boardroom doors she had opened for them. Her name was mispronounced, misspelled, misplaced entirely. But she never flinched. Every insult was absorbed, not ignored, not forgotten, stored. She remembered the first time she heard the phrase. It was an intern, joking too loudly, trying to impress the junior associate beside him. He said it without hesitation, with a smirk so careless it nearly knocked the wind from her. Go back to the kitchen. The others laughed. She had smiled politely, as though it didn't sting. But inside, something broke. Or perhaps it finally fused together. A silent vow formed in the space they left for her to disappear into. She wouldn't go back. She would go forward. After hours, when the office dimmed and the chatter faded, she stayed behind. She used the silence. She reviewed financial data, developed business models, compared acquisition strategies. She spoke to no one about what she was building. Not because she was afraid, but because she had learned that exposure invited sabotage. The fewer who knew her plan, the fewer who could attempt to stop it. She lived frugally. Every paycheck was dissected, every spare dollar routed into carefully calculated investments. She spent nights studying not just the industry, but the human ecosystem that fed it. How ambition moved through rooms, how egos inflated behind spreadsheets, how power disguised itself in confident lies. She read biographies of fallen executives and watched how their empires crumbled. She took lessons from their arrogance. She wrote none of it down. It lived in her, quietly multiplying. There were promotions she was passed over for. Men with fewer qualifications rose faster. Women who played the role more gently were rewarded more swiftly. She congratulated them all. She never showed envy. She stayed focused on something bigger. She knew she didn't need a better desk or a bigger title to matter. What she needed was equity. And she would earn it, not through favors or flattery, but through ownership. In meetings where she was allowed to sit in, she listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, her suggestions were often repeated by others, louder, later. She nodded. She waited. She watched. When she saw an opportunity, she took it, never greedily, always strategically. She offered solutions before anyone noticed problems. She predicted outcomes before others saw the trends. She began to attract the attention of people who mattered, not because she demanded it, but because they needed her. They still didn't know her. Not really. Not the way they knew each other. She wasn't invited to the after-hours drinks. She wasn't asked about her weekend. She was there to make things work, to clean up behind them, to keep the machine moving. Or so they thought. But beneath their noise, beneath their ignorance, beneath their disrespect, she had already built the scaffolding of something much larger than any of them could see. The building she walked into every day was not a fortress keeping her out. It was a foundation she had been preparing to stand on. And soon it would carry her name. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows, casting long shadows across the open office floor. The executives arrived in staggered waves, their shoes clicking against the marble tiles, exchanging greetings with carefully curated confidence. She moved among them like wind through steel beams, present but ignored. Her face didn't trigger recognition. Her presence didn't command space. She was still that woman with quiet eyes and deliberate steps, the one who always carried more than she let others see. But now things were shifting. She had spent the last year acquiring influence in silence. While the others obsessed over titles and office locations, she tracked internal weaknesses. She watched departments rise and fall on poor leadership. She learned how blame was passed, how credit was stolen, how the structure of the company bent under the weight of its own denial. And she positioned herself just beneath every collapse, quietly offering solutions that made her indispensable without ever making her visible. She didn't need a spotlight. She needed leverage. Her investments began small. Minority shares in subsidiaries, silent partnerships through shell entities, quiet buy-ins on struggling vendors she knew the company depended on. No one asked where she got the capital. No one imagined the woman coordinating logistics was the one whose signature now appeared on obscure financial statements. They didn't look closely enough to connect the dots. Why would they? She was still, to them, just a face in the hallway. Just a woman with good organizational skills. Just someone who stayed late and worked hard and asked for nothing in return. They didn't know about the night she stood alone in the copy room and cried because her idea had been pitched by someone else and praised as genius. They didn't know about the morning she almost didn't come back because the weight of invisibility felt too permanent. They didn't know how close she had come to believing them. But she had returned. Not because she felt obligated to the job, but because she had made a promise to herself, one that had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with transformation. With every move she made, she reinforced her position beneath the surface. She learned where the money moved, who the decision-makers really were, which departments were hemorrhaging resources while pretending to grow. She understood more about the company than anyone sitting at the top. Not because she was told, but because she had listened, documented, connected. The systems that others took for granted were the very ones she studied until they no longer held power over her. She was inside them now, like code rewriting itself. One day, a partner from an affiliated firm visited the office. Someone powerful. Someone strategic. And when he shook her hand in the lobby, he paused. He recognized her, not from this office, but from a negotiation table 3 months prior. She had been there representing an investor group that had quietly purchased controlling interest in a small but vital wing of the company. He gave her a look that said everything: surprise, then calculation, then something bordering on respect. It was the first time she saw in someone's eyes a flicker of understanding of who she might really be. But she didn't flinch. She simply returned the gaze, nodded, and let the others guide him upstairs. No one questioned the moment. No one asked why he had hesitated. And she was glad. It meant she still had time. At home, she worked through nights, cross-referencing internal memos with acquisition timelines, mapping out the board members' interests, reviewing legal frameworks for internal takeovers. Every detail mattered. Every comma in every contract. Every outdated clause. She had found cracks in the armor, and through those cracks she had begun to plant the seeds of a revolution. She knew she would not be welcomed. She would not be celebrated. Her arrival at the top would be met with resistance, confusion, even hostility. But she didn't want their approval. She didn't need applause. She needed control. Not for revenge. For repair. For redefinition. Because the company they had built was powerful but deeply flawed. It succeeded by burying the people who made it work. She would change that. Not through slogans. Through structure. The shares were nearly hers. The final pieces were falling into place. All that remained was timing. And she was very good at waiting. The building felt different now, though nothing had visibly changed. The same fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The same hushed tension floated through the elevator air. But beneath it all was a current, a vibration only she could feel. It pulsed through her steps as she moved through the corridors. She no longer felt like she was walking among giants. She felt like the walls were shrinking, revealing the fragile scaffolding beneath the polished surface. She passed men who had once spoken over her. Their voices still carried, still filled rooms, but they no longer reached her the same way. She had learned to separate sound from substance. She saw the empty confidence. She knew who hid behind performance and who actually did the work. She had studied their movements long enough to mimic them if she wanted to, but she never did. She had no need to pretend. Her strength was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. Legal. Absolute. She watched the internal politics unfold around her like a poorly written play. Meetings were held to appease egos. Emails crafted with veiled threats and coded praise. Departments jockeyed for resources, managers protected their turf with fragile pride. She floated above it now, watching, knowing, calculating. The final documents were ready. Her attorneys had crafted them with surgical precision. The holding group she controlled through layers of proxies was poised to take formal control of the board. The current CEO was unaware. He was in talks about expanding the company's reach overseas, oblivious to the reality that he was already being replaced. She remembered the first time she saw him. How he had leaned across a desk and asked if she could smile more often. How he had once referred to her as the assistant who makes great muffins, not realizing she held a master's degree in finance. She didn't hate him. Hatred required too much space. What she felt was something colder, cleaner, a total and irreversible detachment. She no longer cared about his opinion. Soon, she would control his future. Her final act of invisibility was deliberate. She sat in meetings with a calm expression while others discussed initiatives she had originated. She listened to projections she already knew were incorrect. She let them underestimate her one last time. Because the moment of unveiling was near. The next board meeting would change everything. Not just for her, but for the entire company. She spent that week preparing. Not emotionally, she had done that for years. She prepared logistically, checked documents, verified ownership stakes, reviewed governance clauses. When she closed her laptop each night, there was no satisfaction in her face. Only stillness. Only the weight of what was coming. She wasn't ascending to prove a point. She was stepping into a role she had already inhabited in spirit for too long. No one congratulated her on the days leading up to it. No one knew they should. They still assumed she was background. Still thought she existed to serve their machine. But she had become the engine. And when she finally pulled the lever, the whole structure would realign around her. The boardroom was colder than usual. Not physically, the temperature hadn't changed, but there was something in the air, a stillness before thunder. The long table gleamed beneath pendant lights. Leather chairs waited for their usual occupants. She entered early, as always, carrying a thin folder and a pen she didn't need. No one noticed her presence. They never did. One executive offered her a distracted nod, assuming she was there to take notes. Another gestured toward the coffee station without making eye contact. She took her seat. Not at the end, not near the window, but dead center. A position no one questioned until she remained there when the meeting was called to order. The room filled with suits and voices, with confident laughter and rehearsed rapport. The CEO walked in last, adjusting his tie, smiling as if he'd already won something. He didn't look at her. He had never learned to. The meeting began. Charts were shown. Metrics discussed. A new product line introduced. She watched it all, her fingers folded neatly before her, the folder unopened. She let them talk. Let them believe. Until the final item on the agenda appeared, board restructuring. The legal representative in the corner, unnoticed until now, cleared his throat. Eyes turned. And everything changed. Documents were passed out. Faces shifted. Confusion spread like smoke. The CEO leaned forward, flipping pages with growing disbelief. One by one, the board members looked toward her. Not because they understood, but because they couldn't find anyone else to blame. She sat perfectly still, not with smugness, but with calm certainty. The silence stretched. Then the questions came. Legal clarifications. Ownership percentages. Timeline verification. It was all real. All final. Through a series of purchases, buybacks, and strategic acquisitions, the controlling interest had changed hands. Her hands. She wasn't requesting a vote. She was notifying them of a fact. The vote had already been cast, through contracts and capital, through diligence they hadn't expected her to possess. The CEO stood, his voice louder now, trying to salvage control through volume. But it was too late. The ink was dry. The chain of authority had broken, and at its end was her name. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. The lawyer explained everything. The board confirmed it. She only looked at them, each one, until they understood what had happened. The meeting ended with no applause. Just the quiet unraveling of old power. She remained seated long after the room emptied, letting the moment settle. Not triumph, but transition. Not vindication, but arrival. The office did not collapse in chaos after the announcement. It held together, as institutions often do, by habit more than loyalty. People returned to their desks. Meetings resumed. Emails were answered. But beneath the surface, a new rhythm began to take hold. One shaped by her presence, not her permission. Her name now adorned the internal memos. Her decisions began to ripple outward, quietly at first, then unmistakably. The changes came subtly. Job titles were restructured, performance evaluations rewritten. Entire departments reorganized based on merit instead of proximity to legacy executives. People who had long operated in the shadows found themselves invited to the table. Those who had relied on politics rather than performance began to feel the ground shift beneath them. She didn't fire anyone immediately. She let the structure breathe, exposed it to light, and watched what withered on its own. She redefined the tone of leadership not by commanding attention but by demonstrating focus. She did not attend ribbon cuttings or host cocktail parties. Instead, she sat in on budget meetings. She visited back offices. She asked questions no one had thought a CEO would bother asking. She remembered names. She remembered numbers. She remembered everything. Because she had been forgotten for so long that memory had become survival. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed down hard, not the work, but the solitude. Few people knew how to speak to her now. Some looked at her with suspicion, others with awe. The ones who had once spoken freely around her now measured every word. She understood. Power distorted perception. Even those who wanted to believe in her struggled to see her as one of them anymore. That was the price. She found moments of clarity in small places, a night shift worker thanking her for extending healthcare benefits, a single mother promoted to management for the first time, a junior analyst whose idea was finally heard. These were the moments she held onto. Not because they made her feel powerful, but because they made her feel purposeful. She didn't seek out the former CEO. He reached out eventually, of course, through formal channels, then more personal ones. She responded professionally, offered nothing extra. He wanted to understand. She had no desire to explain. The truth was simple. She had earned what he had inherited, and now it was hers. The company began to be talked about in new terms. Not just profitable but principled. Not just competitive but visionary. She wasn't chasing innovation for the sake of disruption. She was building stability, sustainability, a culture where silence was no longer confused for obedience, and confidence was no longer a performance of entitlement. And yet, despite everything she now controlled, she never let go of the quiet. She still arrived early, still walked the halls alone, still listened more than she spoke. Her power didn't come from changing who she was. It came from never letting them change her. There was no ceremony, no fireworks, no announcement to the world. Just a quiet morning, 1 year to the day since she had claimed the title, when she unlocked the main entrance before anyone else arrived and stood in the center of the lobby. She looked around at the building that had once felt too large for her presence, too cold for her voice. Now it simply felt like a tool, one she had learned how to wield. The people who passed her in the early hours didn't all know the details of her rise. Many had joined after she'd already taken control. To them, she was just the CEO, respected, mysterious, effective. They didn't know the years she had spent in that same building being dismissed, underestimated, forgotten. And she didn't tell them, not because she was hiding, but because it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the structure had changed. She had created policies that ensured transparency in hiring, in pay, in promotion. She had dismantled the invisible ladders that favored ego over ethics. She built mentorship programs, funded education reimbursements, restructured leadership training to include emotional intelligence as a metric. She elevated people who never thought they'd be seen. And slowly, a culture emerged that mirrored her philosophy. Work should be fair, effort should be visible, and no one should have to become someone else to be valued. She watched a new generation of women move through the halls with purpose. Not fearful, not flattened, not forced to shrink to fit someone else's comfort. They stood straight, spoke clearly, knew their worth. And when they entered the boardroom, they weren't handed coffee. They were handed decisions. There were still challenges. Markets shifted. Competitors circled. But she met every obstacle with the same quiet relentlessness that had carried her this far. She had weathered far worse than spreadsheets and shareholder doubt. She had survived a system designed to bury her. And she had emerged, not simply intact, but elevated. On some evenings, when the building emptied out and the city lights cast their reflection against the windows, she would stand alone in her office and breathe, not as a ritual, not as celebration, but as remembrance. For every time she had nearly walked away, For every time someone had told her to lower her voice, soften her tone, dress differently, smile more. For every insult that was supposed to break her, they had only sharpened her. She never forgot the moment she was told to go back to the kitchen. It echoed less now, not because the words had lost power, but because she had taken that power back. Not through revenge, through vision, through permanence. And now, when she walked into the room, no one dared to tell her where she belonged, because she had built the room. And the doors no longer closed behind her. They opened for everyone she brought with her.